Thanks for watching ERi-TV, dear viewers. Welcome to this week's special edition of Open Mic with my guest for this evening, Ms. Susan Ngongi. She is the UN Resident Coordinator here to Eritrea. This is not her first time, at our floor, so welcome back again.
Thank you, but it's been a long time since I was here.
Okay, all right. So our subject for this evening is going to be the UN at 75 years. Okay, so we all know that the UN system generally stands to support governments and countries all over the world in their to achieve their development targets. Okay, so and this year we celebrate 75 years since its founding. How do you feel about this momentous date, and how important would you say has the organization been to our world since its inscription?
It's a very important date. 75 years is a long time. The UN was born on the ashes of World War II. So the primary aim actually was to promote peace and security. And second, to promote development and human rights standard. And third, for the UN to be that platform where nations can get together in order to work towards those aspirations. I think the UN has been useful in the world. In terms of peace and security, we never had a World War III. Of course, there were many other conflicts that the UN was not able to prevent. Of course, there was the War of Liberation here in Eritrea. There was the no war, no peace situation. And we know that the UN was not able to prevent those. But I think in terms of conflicts that could spill over and be of a global nature, the UN has been able to do that on the peace and security side. On the development side, I think the UN has played a very important role in terms of supporting governments to promote access to basic social services, health, education, water, things like that. The UN, I think, has played a very credible role. The UN also has been active in the economic sphere, and through its agencies, associated agencies like the World Bank and the IMF, has also been providing advice to governments in terms of the economy in terms of the economies. So I think the UN has played a credible role, but of course the world in 2020 is very different from the world in 1945. Exactly. So part of the challenge of the United Nations is how to adapt to today's world. One of the striking differences is that today the UN has 193 member states, practically all of humanity is represented there somehow. But when the UN was started, it had only 51 member states that signed up to it. So a significant change, but the challenge for the UN, of course, is adapting to the world of today and being relevant in today's world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Ms. Susan. How would you sum up, the UN's work here in Eritrea since the country's independence, and how has the relations developed since then?
I'll start with the relationship first. I think the relationship has never been better, quite frankly, between the UN and the government of Eritrea and the people of Eritrea. Of course, we cannot separate the UN from Eritrea's history, and there have been difficulties in the relationship, obviously. The time of the liberation struggle, the time of the no war, no peace. But things, I think, have improved significantly following the lifting of the sanctions, and also there were UN sanctions in 2009 and 2011. But the lifting of the sanctions, I think, opened a new chapter in that relationship between the UN and the state of Eritrea, and we're working on building and improving that relationship. Of course, as a country team, as the UN that has been present in the country, I think the relationship has always been very good and very cordial. But of course, we do not exist outside of the bigger UN family, and I think the relationship has really improved significantly of late, and we look forward to building it further.
Okay, so I'm just going to add up a question here. I mean, in the task of the development challenges that we have had, I want you to specify more of the UN's role here.
In terms of development challenges, the government of Eritrea has always been very keen to, since the liberation, to expand basic social services to all Eritreans. And I think the UN has been able to work and support the government in terms of furthering these goals in the areas of health, in the areas of education, in the areas of water, in areas of agriculture as well, that has been linked to water. I think the UN has been significantly helpful in these areas of basic social services. Of course, the UN has done other things, but I think that's the area where the greatest collaboration has taken place.
Even more so. I mean, we have achieved tremendously in the Millennium Development Goals.
Definitely, yeah.
So I want you to say a few words in that regard, because this has happened between in the midst of the 75 years of the UN.
That's true. I think the MDGs, Eritrea scored a lot of successes in the MDGs. It was one of the most successful ones, I think, on the African continent, and especially in the areas of health. If I remember my numbers correctly, sort of one of the top 10 on the continent. Significant progress in terms of reducing maternal mortality, reducing child mortality, of improving overall life span of Eritreans. Tremendous progress was made, and with very little, from what we can see, it seems like very little at very low cost. I don't know if that makes sense, because there was, if you look at the amount of money that went into the achievement of these goals, and the results that were achieved, it was incredibly efficient. The government did a very efficient job. Of course, since 2015, we are in the SDG era, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a lot more, a lot higher in terms of our ambition, our collective ambition, as the member states of the United Nations. And we're hoping that in this area as well, Eritrea will be able to really perform as well as it did on the previous goals.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Ms. Susan. Now, like you've said earlier, the challenges of today are not the same like the challenges of yesterday. And the world in 2020 has faced an unprecedented health emergency, the COVID-19. How do you see Eritrea's response to the pandemic?
So far, I think Eritrea has been doing relatively well. But of course, with COVID, the pandemic, it's many crises in one. It's a health crisis, but it's also a socioeconomic crisis and many other things hidden there as well. So the immediate, of course, is the health crisis. We have to make sure that people don't die, they stay alive. And I think the government has done a very good job. I think we all woke up to this sometime in February, that indeed this will affect all of us. And the government took measures early on. Already in March, there was guidance on how we should be behaving vis-a-vis COVID. Asking people to voluntarily not come to the country, if I remember correctly. I think March 11, we got sort of comprehensive guidance. And by April the 2nd, we were in a very strict lockdown because the virus had already entered into the country through travelers. It was very clear that the government had a two-pronged approach. The first was just to prevent. And the second was to make sure that whoever got the disease got adequate treatment. In fact, so far, we don't have severe cases. We haven't recorded severe cases yet. And thankfully, no death. So the government, I think, in terms of the health side of the emergency, has done a really good job in terms of managing it. Today, you and I can talk like this in this studio. We're living a relatively normal existence. I mean, with some restrictions, of course, but it's relatively normal. And that's because there's no generalized transmission of the virus. And we know that the concentration of the virus thus far is in the border areas, the borders with Sudan, with Ethiopia, Djibouti, nationals coming back through irregular routes. So far contained, and we all feeling relatively secure. But of course, there's also the socioeconomic impact of this crisis. It is big everywhere, and it is big here too. And I know that the government has been doing a lot to try and cushion the most vulnerable persons in society. And Eritrea has been tapping into its traditional solidarity mechanisms in making sure that people are taken care of. But the impacts are severe. And my understanding of the nature of this disease is the impacts will unfold with time. So we are not seeing the worst of it today. I would imagine that with time it becomes even more serious. And of course, I hope that the response is commensurate, of course, with the impacts that we'll be seeing.
Ms. Susan, I'm going to go to a global perspective now. The pandemic is a global problem.
Yes.
And as such, it needs to be tackled in tandem with all the nations working together. What has the role of the UN been in this regard?
Well, I think first and foremost, from the start of this pandemic, the UN has been trying to advocate first and foremost for global solidarity. Our world today is a very fractured one. We're not very together. In fact, we saw the impulses was for nations to look inward and to turn their backs on their neighbors. And as you mentioned, this virus needs to be tackled collectively, no matter how well one works within their own national borders. And everybody has to work extremely hard within their own national borders to control it. But no matter how well you do that, you have to coordinate with everybody else to make sure that we can effectively suppress the virus. So I think the first was the UN was advocating for global solidarity, making sure that we should be looking outward. But second, also, the UN has been mobilizing a lot of funds to support national governments. Firstly, with the health response. Firstly with the health response, but also from April, really looking at the socioeconomic impacts, because it became very clear that those impacts were severe. Many governments had lockdowns, effective in terms of suppressing the virus. That's exactly what we needed to do at that point. But it also came at a huge cost. Exactly. And therefore, how to support governments to support their people to minimize the impacts, the economic impacts that were felt. Mm-hmm. Here in Eritrea, for instance, I know that in the early days, if I remember correctly, the government did issue instructions that businesses had to continue paying their people for some months, at least. But still, I would imagine that the impacts are still great, especially on the hospitality industry. The fact that public transportation is still not working, the impacts are huge. Mm-hmm.
Still on the challenges of COVID-19, Ms. Susan, and within the context of the government of Eritrea's success rate in controlling the spread through, like you've said, preventive approach. Mm-hmm. Okay, how has the UN in Eritrea been part of the fight against COVID-19?
We've been part of, I think in the early days, the mantra was, washing hands and infection control and prevention. And I think the UN, especially through the agencies of UNICEF, UNDP, UNFPA, etc., were supporting the Ministry of Health in terms of this strategy. And then after that, the UN also tried to support the government in terms of supporting supplies for COVID response. Mm-hmm. So those are the main areas that the UN has been able to work with the government. I know that the government has been responding to the socioeconomic impacts as mentioned earlier, and I hope that's an area that we can work with the government in future.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Ms. Susan, what is the impact of COVID-19 on world developments, especially now that we have this UN strategy of the Sustainable Development Goals, like you've said, and how has it affected its strategy in the goals? It's
been a huge effect because COVID-19 came and we all saw this huge, as I mentioned, the health crisis, first of all, and the socioeconomic impacts. And the fear that we now have is that the gains that had been made against the goals, already we were behind, but the gains that have been made against the goals might be reversed. Because in this particular situation, a lot of poverty has increased, or is increasing. Mm-hmm. The impacts, other social gains that had been made, we hear that in many places women and girls have fared really badly in this pandemic. Gender-based violence has increased in many areas. I think the big fear now is that there will be some erosion of the gains that had been made because of the impacts of COVID-19. And so we're working very hard to try and make sure that we can all be more innovative in terms of our response. COVID also really exposed a lot of the problems that the world had before. Issues of inequality were always there. There were chronic issues, but COVID really exposed it and to some extent exacerbated it. So I think in our response to COVID, in trying to recover from the impacts of COVID, we have to be thinking about how we can implement our goals better. So we cannot implement necessarily the same models that we were implementing before. We might need to think of new models. How do we implement development in a way that does not increase inequalities? In Eritrea, you have a relatively good track record in terms of the government prioritizing those who are most vulnerable and those who are furthest away from the capital. That is not the case everywhere. But how can we make now, in our own development plans, in our own development programs, building programs that truly, A, tackle inequalities, and B, certainly don't exacerbate them.
Ms. Susan, we're talking about 10 years now left for the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes.
Deadline, literally. So we have to make rectifications, or we are just going to wait until that day comes up and then, check the countries and their achievements. Is that how we're going to do it?
Member states at the political level were the ones who met and agreed on these Sustainable Development Goals. The UN, the civil service part of the UN's job is to support members to try and implement the political agreement that they have made. Are the Sustainable Development Goals ambitious? Definitely. Is it looking as if we might not meet them in 10 years? But what choice do we have but to roll up our sleeves and really make sure that we do the best we can to tackle them? Because many of the aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals, especially the first 6, for instance, when we talk about poverty.
Poverty, exactly.
I think we really have to do more, and we have to push ourselves of doing more. But also, issues of climate change. It's become very clear that, we cannot afford to postpone actions on climate change for some far future. We have to work on it now.
Exactly.
So I think for all governments, everybody is at a slightly different place. The entry points are slightly different for each government, but within a nation, to figure out what the key entry points are and to work on those and give it our best shot and make sure that within 10 years we can show collectively a remarkable change in the lives of people.
Ms. Susan, we thank you for your time, but before that, any final words you would like to say to the people and government of Eritrea on this auspicious occasion of the UN at 75 years?
Yes, I mean, the UN is the premier multilateral organization. We know that multilateralism has been suffering even pre-COVID. It is very clear in the way that the world is tackling COVID that multilateralism is suffering, but that's precisely what we need to tackle an issue such as this and climate change and others that are looming in the horizon. So I think we all need ideas. As mentioned earlier, the world today is very different from the world of when the UN was created. And we all need to contribute ideas of how we're going to help the organization be better fit to support the important multilateral role that it plays.
Thank you so much again for your time. Dear viewers, that was Ms. Namondo Ngongi, the resident coordinator of the UN to Eritrea. And for our program, it is good night.